A very warm welcome to our second workshop. I'm Pelagia Goulimari, the convener of three workshops entitled After Modernism, Women, Gender, Race. We have four wonderful speakers for you today: Lilith Acadia, Susan Arndt, Jane Hiddleston, and Saul Nelson. They will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes each, presenting their recent work on aspects of our topic. Please do send written comments and questions throughout the event. They will be collated by Hawa Ibrahim, Kathleen Quaintance, and Tori Chockwell Mangan. In the final section of the workshop, they will be reading out your comments and questions, giving our speakers feedback and the chance to respond. Many thanks to Torch, Women in the Humanities, and the students of the interdisciplinary MST in Women's Studies for enabling this workshop. If I may say a few words about our speakers, El Acadia is Assistant Professor of Literary Theory in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at Taiwan National University, with a PhD in rhetoric from Berkeley and an MST in Women's Studies from Oxford. Current research interests include pretext, translation, censorship, queerness, and literature beyond the novel. Susan Arndt is professor of English literatures at Bayreuth University in Germany. She has worked on Shakespeare, intertextuality, as well as intersectionality and critical race studies. Her book, Sexism, History of an Oppression, has just been published. Her book, Racism, Power and Knowledge, is about to be published. Jane Hiddleston is professor of literatures in French at Oxford and official fellow in French at Exeter College, Oxford. She has published widely on postcolonial theory and Francophone literature, including most recently the book Writing After Postcolonialism, Francophone North African Literature in Transition. She's currently working on a study of Fanon and literature entitled France Fanon, Literature and Invention. Saul Nelson is studying for a DPhil in Contemporary Art, History and Theory at Oxford. His research takes a dialectical approach to the concepts of belatedness and regression in modernist painting. Let me now turn to our first speaker, Lilith. It is now past midnight in Taiwan. Thank you very much for joining us.
Two crocodiles, wearing shiny, black, long-haired mink coats, walked into a shop, outside of which hung a small hand-lettered pine placard that read, Lacoste, the crocodile label, imported clothing and accessories. They began stroking a dark blonde mink coat in the shop. They couldn't bear to let go of it, as if they, since their genders remain unknown, crocodiles all take the same form of address for the purpose of efficient communication, were the only ones whom the coat flattered. What would the shopkeeper say? The passage goes on to ask. Oh, you're a crocodile. The shopkeeper had seen crocodiles before. Introspective crocodiles, preoccupation with emotion, desire, luxury imports, critiquing gender and capitalism, pursuing a hypothetical storyline. But that's not how the novel begins. And you don't really have crocodiles until the 5th chapter of the 2nd notebook. But Notes of a Crocodile doesn't seem like the sort of book you should introduce with page 1 or all at once, nor should a presentation of it begin with the customary beginning. But so that you're not too scandalized, and because it's Thanksgiving, and because I mean it sincerely, thank you, Pelagia, for the invitation to join this exciting conversation, Rethinking Modernism. Thanks also to Torch and the MST postgrads for your organizing work to put on this event, and to the other participants, particularly from the first workshop. Your talks were so thought-provoking. I hope you'll see how they inform my presentation. In the first workshop's Q&A, Susan Stanford Friedman offered this excellent framing of what she calls the de-Eurocentering modernism, and what Pelagia proposed as the spatial and temporal revision of modernism. Rather than limiting literary modernism to European cultural capitals 1890 to 1940, she proposed that we can find modernism in the radical breaks in aesthetic form during the periods of concentrated change across sectors that follow imperial violent conquests, and that these bring a cosmopolitan mixing of people that create huge epistemological shifts and an intensification of the hybrid of culture. This lens brings early 1990s Taipei into focus as a site of modernist work because, well, let me share what the past centuries had brought. Indigenous groups inhabited Taiwan for 5,000 years, and the Japanese began trying to rule parts of Taiwan in the 16th century. Then there were periods of Spanish and Dutch colonization in the 17th, with nods to the Portuguese who named it Formosa. And then the arrival of the Hoklo from China. The Hoklo were Han. From an indigenous perspective, this is also colonization. They stole land from the indigenous peoples and began to drive them into the mountains. And to this day, some people still erroneously call them mountain people. 1683 was the first year that parts of Taiwan came under Chinese rule, when one of the Qing dynasty sent out imperial expansionist forces. And I want to take a moment here to note that Susan Stanford Friedman talked about archipelago studies. And up to this time in China, the islands were antithetical to the Chinese imperial concept of the nation. So this idea of having an island and actually a group of islands become part of the nation state was a tension. And that plays into the story in other ways. British and French colonists had tried to take the island, as did the Japanese, but they were not successful until 1895, after the First Sino-Japanese War. China ceded Taiwan to the Japanese, who quickly took control. Though the Qing Chinese rulers had stated the indigenous populations were not part of their control, the Japanese pursued total rule, even isolating some indigenous populations for anthropological observation. The Japanese infrastructure in Taiwan still exists today, particularly the intellectual infrastructure. For the first time, they combined the island, including outlying islands like Orchid Island, where they were setting up this anthropological lab. So part of the intellectual infrastructure was establishing National Taiwan University, which was part of the Japanese imperial system, modeled architecturally and pedagogically after what is now the University of Tokyo. So perhaps now is a good time to read you the first page, which is set at NTU, National Taiwan University. July 20th, 1991. Picked up my college diploma at the service window of the registrar's office. It was so big I had to carry it with both hands. I dropped it twice while walking across campus. The first time it fell in the mud by the sidewalk, and I wiped the mud off with my shirt. The second time the wind blew it away. I chased after it ruefully. The corners were bent. In my heart, I held back a pitiful laugh. For the students in the group, I hope that scene is as poignant to you as it is to me, muddy, bent corner degrees. So meanwhile, in China, a revolution brought the end of the Qing dynasty, and the Republic of China started under the rule of Sun Yat-sen, who used Han ethnic chauvinism to organize people against the Manchu Qing dynasty. And then it was a unifying principle of the new republic. Han chauvinism continues to inform Chinese domestic and foreign policy, as we can see in the cultural genocide of Tibetans and Uyghurs. When the Japanese surrendered to the Chinese at the end of World War II, they relinquished Taiwan and the surrounding islands to the Chinese Chiang Kai-shek, who brought over 2 million nationalists escaping Cultural Revolution in China to Taiwan, which had a population of roughly 500,000. So you can imagine how Taiwan locals reacted to an influx of foreigners claiming power in a new land. And the KMT saw Taiwan as a temporary stopping off point until they could return to the mainland and overthrow the communists. To secure power, the KMT came down hard on any political dissidents or anyone suspected of anti-government sentiments. 140,000 Taiwanese were imprisoned, thousands executed or disappeared. Beyond this cultural trauma, this era known as the White Terror affected art and literature. Children were beaten for speaking languages other than Mandarin in schools. Foreign authors like Emily Bronte were banned. Translators of foreign literature were jailed, and there was censorship of the media, music, literature. The settler colonial requirements of acculturation that Ola Osman described in the Liberian context in Workshop 1 really resemble the KMT's demands of acculturation and the suppression of culture that existed before their arrival. When Chiang Kai-shek's son began to democratize the island and ended martial law in 1987, the island experienced a rebirth. You'll recall from the opening that Notes of a Crocodile establishes itself right away as a Bildungsroman, not only an intellectual coming of age of graduating, but a sexual coming of age of love and lustless sex, emo musings on doomed relationship. Here's an aphorism from about midway through, like a slip of paper stuck between vignettes, showing the parallel rebirth of the narrator, finding herself through truth in the shards of shattered love, and the rebirth of the country, learning how to love and trust and become a new democracy from the shards of shattered imperial regimes. Here Taiwan is, after 4 centuries of imperial conquest and cosmopolitan mixing of European and East Asian cultures, a quintupling of the population in a few short years due to an influx of migration. And that migration was mostly composed of the elites, the intellectuals of the Chinese Republic. And then a particularly violent 40 years of foreign rule. It is shattering, and those shards show us the elements Professor Friedman discussed last time. The successive Japanese and then Chinese regimes had brought huge epistemological shifts. And the country opened up to democracy in the 80s, a decade when technology was booming. The country was nostalgic for past colonizers, including the Japanese and Europeans. Each successive colonizer had brought epistemological shifts, and through policing and censorship in the White Terror era, the KMT had tightly controlled acceptable knowledge, language, and expression. Now, the lifting of martial law was like removing the lid of a pressure cooker without first releasing the steam. There was a creative explosion. Late in the 80s and early 90s, Taipei was alive with music and literature, especially in the universities. And this is the moment when Chu Miaojing is at NTU. Though from the central west coast of Taiwan, she attended a prestigious girls' school in Taipei and studied psychology at NTU, which is Taiwan's version of Oxbridge as one university. So this was the center of political and cultural transformations. The year Notes of a Crocodile was published, she moved to Paris to study with Hélène Cixous, and a year died. supposedly by stabbing herself multiple times with a kitchen knife. One of the incisive questions Pelagia posed in the workshop notes is about canonization. And the question acknowledges that this is a difficult concept in any context. Chu is number 10 on Google's most famous Taiwanese authors results. And when I was interviewing undergrads and master's students at NTU to be my research assistants, most of them had heard of Chu and none had read her, which sounds pretty canonical. Just as elsewhere, canon is a tricky question in Taiwan because Taiwanese literature is still taught under Chinese literature, even today. And this categorization depends on a double colonial presumption. First, that pre-Chinese Taiwanese literature is irrelevant, as though after World War II, the KMT brought culture to the literary void of an island. And second, that the relevant literary legacy of contemporary Taiwanese literature is from mainland China, not pre-Chinese Taiwan, nor any of the other imperial influences for whom they had this nostalgia. Chu's explicit references to, I would say, modernist Japanese authors Haruki Murakami and Kobo Abe are clear repudiations of this assumption. And I read her references to her Intro to Chinese Lit class as a discomfort with and then rejection of the imperialist claim to Taiwanese literature. She comes in late to class, is an embarrassment. It offers her romance, but that romance turns out ultimately to be unhealthy. It's the only class the reader attends with her. Intro to Chinese Lit is the representative academic experience of a novel about college life. It's formative, central, a social center, a recurring theme, yet it's a class she knows she needs to escape. After some character development, the vignette before begins, "I am a woman who loves other women. The tears I cry, they spring from a river and drain across my face like yolk." After these tears, she decides not to keep producing forced smiles and not to go to Intro to Chinese Lit. It's reflective of a disengagement with her romance, yet the romantic partner is one that she met in that first Chinese Lit class who passed her a note. So perhaps that romance is representative of the Chinese literary canon. And a few lines down, she asks, "You're not going to ask me why I'm going to stop going to Chinese Lit?" Signaling to the reader to look for a deeper reason not to attend Intro to Chinese Lit, not to listen to that history of literature that subsumes Taiwanese literature. Instead, she's going to come out as a lesbian, then, in the next vignette, break out of the Chinese tradition. She is decolonizing herself out of the canon and into a new canon. Because I think what makes Chu canonical is also what makes her modernist. She belongs to something new, something transforming. She belongs to a certain generation of writers who introduced a new Taiwanese literature at a transformative moment for the country, breaking out of years of aesthetic suppression, testing the boundaries of what was politically, socially, and aesthetically possible. Earlier this semester, I had a meeting with one of my mentors here, Hamilton Young, who was a college student in Taipei in the early 90s. And he describes how full, alive with the new literature the city was, how literature students in Taipei at the end of the 80s and the early 90s were excited to run to other campuses to hear authors like Chu reading their work, to learn about what was being published by underground publishers and then also the renowned publishers of the city. This was a time of literary explosion. Fu Qingkang calls Chu a simulacrum of Taiwanese writers of her generation, arguing that though she has a different writing style than her contemporaries, her writing expresses the drive to find truth following the disappearance of truth. She is a writer of this moment of what Fu calls sudden liberation under long-term repression. In addition to this historical framing of Notes of a Crocodile, published in 1994 at the height of this post-martial law literary renaissance, we can also identify formal elements suggesting modernism, those radical breaks of aesthetic form. Notes of a Crocodile is subversive and performative. The human and crocodile protagonists both subvert cultural expectations, stereotypes, the crocodile speaks, and perhaps they even subvert their own desires while consciously performing their subversions and simultaneously trying to pass, not permanently, but rather to pass through until they can be liberated. The human protagonist, Lazi, until she can escape to France, just like the author, and the crocodile until society allows it to live openly as a crocodile. The narrative and chronology are disjointed, broken, interrupting, with Woolf's tunneling technique of telling the past in installments that Elizabeth Abel discussed in Workshop 1, and the mixing of times and subverting of linearity that Dorothée Boulanger described as well last workshop. Another parallel with Vera's Nehanda, I should note, is the double narration with shorter excerpts between chapters as Chu weaves together the human and crocodile protagonist storylines, and they were published just a year apart. And then in the novel, there is a tension, especially in the parts about the crocodile, between an inward introspective gaze of an angsty student coming of age or a crocodile stewing in a basement room, and then in contrast, the public gaze of the other students or the media. Yang Yingqing writes about this tension of the introspective and the public views across Chu's writing, including her famous diaries from Paris. Wu Peiqi categorizes Chu's writing as modernist because of her epistolary form, mixing diary entries, fictional news stories, vignettes, aphorisms, notes passed in class as we saw above, or delivered in an envelope as this one. How's that for the modernist aesthetic of the envelope Elizabeth Abel talked about? This passage also demonstrates my favorite element, the phenomenology of Chu's modernism. Her descriptions are often phenomenological, focused on the sensation, movement, appearance, or dismemberment of bodies and body parts. Later, protagonist Lazi chops off her long hair with all its hair politique, as Mimi Thi Nguyen calls it in My Hair Trauma. All the valences of queer signaling, rejecting gender stereotypes, rejecting colonial exoticization, and breaking with tradition. She will no longer look like the women who came before. This rejection also extends to how she sees herself in a literary legacy. Rather than seeing earlier generations of women modernists as modernist ancestresses, Chu, via the writer-narrator, repeatedly places herself as a creative descendant of Derek Jarman and Jean Genet, giving her gay identity primacy over her gender identity, and choosing a contemporary rather than a parental figure. This choice queers the traditional intellectual lineage. Though I should also note she references new wave and experimental filmmakers like Jean Godard and Tarkovsky. She inserts directions like freeze frame and closes the novel with a description of an imaginary film scene with the crocodile, comparing itself to Jean Genet. Jump cut. I hope everyone will continue to like me, even if I stay out of sight. Oh my goodness, I can't eat cream puffs anymore, and I'm living in a prison like Genet. Oh, that's right. I want to perform a bit of The Ballad of the Crocodile. Do you all mind? The camera cuts back to the seaside. The crocodile sat in a wooden bathtub with a burning torch mounted to its side. A finger abruptly enters the frame, pointing at the bathtub as it drifts out to sea, and suddenly the entire bathtub erupted into flames. As the camera zoomed in slowly, the image on the screen dissolved into a sea of fire. And she ends with, as Jarman said, quote, "I have nothing more to say. I wish you all the best." the lesbian identity in this legacy of European gay identity that Lazi, the human narrator, presents, and the lesbian culture depicts throughout Notes of a Crocodile contribute to the novel's significance in Taiwanese literature. This lesbian culture is situated throughout the text in the Taipei cityscape, referencing recognizable streets and bridges, even specific buildings, like here, the portico of my department. And they're all familiar to a local reader, claiming the city as a lesbian space, which it has become. It also serves as a cultural Bildungsroman, Lazi's coming of age. Her first love and sexual exploration mirror the emergence and experimentation of a new Taiwan, and her alienation, then rebellion, reflect the non-dominant culture finding its voice after 40 years of suppression. Pelagia asked us to consider how women modernists engaged with historical events and participated in constructing communities. And I see this as how Lazi creates lesbian Taipei. Lazi's gender and sexual queerness resist being the idealized female vessel of national culture. And it's an invitation for the Taiwanese to resist assimilation into colonial culture. Her transitions mark a cultural and literary transformation in Taiwan. Imagine an overstuffed bag of tricks, Chu writes. You're handed an empty bag at the start of your education, and you're allowed to put anything you want inside of it. This is her model of the university. And Notes of a Crocodile is gazing into that bag of tricks that is the new Taiwan and tempting the reader to imagine what else they might find. Thank you. And I'd like to turn now to Susan Art. Thank you.
Sorry, so you didn't hear me?
We couldn't hear, but now we can.
Okay, but okay, good. Okay, sorry. So I start again. I'm so sorry. So you can see me and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I wish to thank again Pelagia for bringing all these wonderful people together, and I learned such a lot, and it is really amazing to be in this space. And I don't know, do you see my PowerPoint? Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
So I will be speaking about Black women's dreaming into futures in times of modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, and also alluding a lot to what was already discussed about multiple modernities and alternate modernities in the process. And I would love to start off with Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival, where the lyric stresses that there are dreams of choice that seek a now that can breed futures. So these verses from Audre Lorde's poem narrate dreams as being about choices and subsequent agency that have the power to generate futures. In doing so, the poem interacts textually with the most well-known dream narration of an ongoing Black revolution, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech from 1963. This dream in turn converses with the American dream, in general, a dream that has actively excluded Black, Indigenous, and people of color from the outset by displaying intersectional racism, as a result of which the former has been forced into being a kind of deferred dream, as Langston Hughes' lyrical eye puts it. Ever since Columbus, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, not only in the Americas, but across the globe, that like was just nicely also demonstrated, have fought against racism and colonialism at the cost of their lives. The colonizers' infliction of physical violence was underlain by colonialist laws, bolstered by racist narrations, postulating that only white people were capable of reason and hence obliged to civilize and modernize the world. In their white conceptions, modernization and modernity were creating the world in their own spitting image, while spitting in the faces of their others. As has been only too well known, this so-called civilizing mission had the sole purpose of legitimizing Marfa, the European enslavement of Africans, and colonialism, and the subsequent theft and exploitation of non-European resources, labor, lives, and futures. So imperialism would have lost this self-constructed legitimization once the colonized were accepted as being modern as well as, or as capable of being truly modernized. Therefore, the imperialist modernization theory had to include the claim that the mission to modernize the world could never be accomplished. Posting itself as the only one with universal validity, Western modernity ushered the colonized into what Dipesh Chakrabarty called the waiting room of history. Rather than cultural, political, or epistemological vacuum and backwardness, Europe encountered fully fledged societies with prosperous histories and modernities, which nonetheless had to be silenced and destroyed by the colonizers. By abusing modernity, therefore, as a tool to violate the world while enforcing intersectional racism, white Western modernity eventually betrayed its own ideals of freedom, equality, and progress, committing atrocities that perpetuated a long-standing tradition of barbaric violence. It is true, white Western modernity was eager to strangle other modernities, and yet these survived into new futures while provincializing Europe and the Americas in the process. So modernities met, multiplied, and entangled. The racism of white Western modernity was called out and resisted by what Paul Gilroy calls counter-modernity, a most notable instance of which was the Harlem Renaissance. Paving Black people's ways toward a more evenly shared American dream, it kept displaying sexism though. Consequently, Black women were moved to spawn their very own race from within the Harlem Renaissance while relying on the power of dreams. So therefore, in this paper, I wish to discuss the two women writers of the Harlem Renaissance and the literary negotiation of the agencies of dreams, which is Georgia Douglas Johnson and Joan Neale Hurston. But before delving into their work, I will very briefly look at the relationship of the Harlem Renaissance to the modernity, followed by a theorization of futures and dreams by focusing on Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, as compared to Sankofa as a Ghanaian mode of memory into futures. So amidst the racist acts of segregation and terrorism, the early 20th century civil rights movement, as represented by seminal figures such as Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and W.E.B. Du Bois, fed Black resistance with new strategies and fire. In addition, the Great Migration brought millions of Black people from the rural South to the industrial urban North. Therefore, to many Blacks, the 1920s felt as a moment in time when the deferred dream was eventually turning into an explosion. This idea informed the very spirit of the Harlem Renaissance. Echoing the reformist break of the humanist age, with the Middle Ages, the Harlem Renaissance aimed to overcome the medievalist economy and violence of Tasman plantations, inspiring to urban future in which the American dream could finally be dreamt more inclusively. In doing so, the Harlem Renaissance was in line with modernity's belief in radical new beginnings and modernism's celebration of interventions, of aesthetic interventions into old certainties while resisting the monologicity of white Western modernity and modernism. So even though white modernism accommodated a wide range of political stances from fascism to communism, it failed to integrate Black agencies. Therefore, the Harlem Renaissance had no other choice, basically, but to resist and remix modernism. This remixing is manifested in jazz, which eventually became the music of the 1920s, not as Black music, but as American music at large. Likewise, Black modernist literature remixed languages, genres, and media by, for example, featuring Black English, patois, Creole, and intertextualities adapted to oral literature. From within this anti-racist struggle, Black women, on the other hand, had to oppose a patriarchal normality as displayed by both white Western modernity or modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. Thus framed, to Black women, even more than to Black men, the spirit of new beginnings had to do with possibilities rather than realities. It was more about dreams and hopes than real changes and achievements that would have allowed one to find safety in resting. It was a fantasy, to invoke Gwendolyn Bennett's eponymous poem from 1927, that was more about sailing than resting, about traveling more than arriving, and more about dreaming up alternative futures than about having arrived in these futures. So this is not to say that dreams do not matter, to the contrary. They are giants when it comes to the making and unmaking of futures. So future denotes more, of course, than time to come. And it is too multifarious to be reduced to the simplicity of any singular. Thus, echoing Audre Lorde, I speak of futures as being polyphonous, relational, and causal. Futures do not happen. They are made or unmade, not by magical scrolls, of course, but by human actors. The respective agencies, however, are positioned within power-coded social spaces. They are molded by both the past and the present, and thus causally interlinked and interlocked. So due to conflicting, competing, and complementary interests, contingencies, options, and possibilities, some futures have supported and advanced each other while destabilizing or preventing others. Therefore, futures are not only about what will or might happen, but also about what could have happened had it not been suffocated or at least deferred. What would have happened if Martha hadn't destroyed millions of lives as well as economic and political structures in Africa, funneling the labor and resources thus stolen into the Industrial Revolution and its modernity. This is not about counterfactual history. It is all about remembering, as Lorde's concluding verses suggest, that Black, Indigenous, and people of color were never meant to survive, and yet did so, building alternate futures as nourished by the bread of the passing dreams of choice. After all, dreams have the capacity to enter, sense, and probe futures, and thus building them in the future. So we were, we are, and will be what we dream of, and we cannot enter futures unless we dream of them. This is all about hope too. So dreams exceed the limits of the plausible, while hopes create new plausibilities. The famous saying, often accredited to Aristotle, hope is a waking dream, suggests that a dream is a moment in an unconscious now, yet with sufficient persistence, a dream may turn into a more sustainable mode of hope. It is this very sense that I speak of in the following of dream hopes, the asterisk is to mark the complementary entanglement of the two concepts. As a joint venture, dream hopes express individual as well as collective thoughts, images, and sensations in various states, ranging all the way from sleep to speech, from likability to unlikability, from being tiny to revolutionary, from the slightest to the highest forms of fulfillment, thus displaying needs, ideas, and desires. If, as Toni Morrison puts it in Playing in the Dark, the subject of the dream is a dreamer, then dream hopes must be about dream hopers. Dream hopers are, however, socially positioned subjects who act within what is possible for them in the given power-coded agencies. The respective dream hopes are molded by such social positions too, and yet they are much freer and thus more powerful than the dream hopers themselves. Just like humans, dream hopes can be silenced. Just like humans, dream hopes can be silenced, but they cannot be imprisoned or killed. While bridging individual and collective visions, they can even survive the physical death of a particular dream hoper. What is more, dream hopes are free in as much as they intervene into realities without being expected to map the road or hand out the tools or manuals of how to reach that dream. As such, dream hopes are time travelers that visit the horizon that keeps projecting evenly shared futures, although they are not here yet in the now. In this sense, dream hopes are not agency per se, but they have the power to offer the agency to move on, intervene, resist, and effect change. Although residing beyond the realm of matter, dream hopes nonetheless materialize when translated into agency and action. The more collective, the more powerful, even when undermining mainstream discourses. So ultimately, dream hopes are a mode of world making on the move, and as such, vital agents in the generation of futures. Dream hoping in turn relies on knowledge offered by memory. So memories can trigger as they can suffocate dream hopes. To see how futures are adapted to memory-driven dream hopes, I will now discuss two examples, comparing Walter Benjamin's Angel of History and the Sankofa, a West African stance on memory-based future making that has influenced the Harlem Renaissance. Walter Benjamin's famous 9th thesis features the Angel of History, inspired by a 1920 sketch by Paul Klee, who himself called it a not yet angel. Rather than being comforting and protecting, Klee's hybrid angel seems lost and in search of comfort and protection. In the face of this disturbance, Benjamin writes, the angel of history must look just so. With his piercing glance, gaping mouth, and stretched wings, the angel looks to Benjamin as if running away from what he stares at. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe that keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. The angel indeed seems to have decided to stay in the very now, not like Goethe's Faust because he longs for its very beauty, but because he's both traumatized by and detached from the past as threatening as the future in the monologic singular thus generated, a catastrophe waiting to happen. Seeing one single catastrophe that keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage, he faces a mountain of rubble. Thus paralyzed, the angel is unable to dream hope. As a result, he can neither move back nor forth in a self-determined way. Agency is not with the angel, but with the storm, and thus with the unwholesome past. But the storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which back to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. As progress is a synecdoche for enlightenment and modernity, the storm also symbolizes its atrocities, National Socialism and the Shoah. Through white modernist thinker Benjamin does not refer to colonialism and mafia here. In light of such progress, the angel does not dare to move on, afraid of a past that cannot but repeat itself. Thus, better futures are smashed. Benjamin's consequent take on history is rather teleological and messianic, giving weak agency to some messianic salvation in the yet side in the now time alone. That is completely different with Akan Sankofa. In Sankofa, in the poem from 1976, poet Albert Kuiper Mensa puts the Akan concept visualized as a bird to verse. The bird is wise, and the lyrical eye knows why. It meets the future undeterred, thus overcoming the paralysis afflicting Benjamin's angel, because it picks from the past what is needed for moving on. In other words, Sankofa is picky about what to invite into the present and its futures. Thus, seen the past is symbolized by an egg as a heteronormative metaphor. And this past is able to feature a dream hope. In given entanglement with the past that offers this dream hope, an agency is nourished that can make or unmake futures that are unwanted. Thus, a bird's bridging of past, present, and futures projects an agency informed by both memory and dream hopes. After all, it is then, that is after, thus dealing with the past, that the bird steps forward. And futures are not given, but are made by agencies, nurtured by memories and dream hope. It is this constellation only that makes it possible to meet futures undeterred. And this is what I want to discuss while looking at the dream hopes as negotiated in the poetry by Georgia Douglas Johnson and Neil Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. The lyrical eye in Georgia Douglas Johnson's Your World starts off from having become used to pressing her wings close to her side. This past of hers is reminiscent of the paralysis of Benjamin's angel of history and the respective take on history and future. So thus tuned, she has become accustomed to abiding in the narrowest nest in a corner. Yet while the wind paralyzes the wings of Benjamin's angel, Johnson's lyrical eye fights this state of stagnation when sighting the distant horizon with a burning desire to travel this immensity. Consequently, rather than staying paralyzed like the angel of history, the lyrical eye mobilizes the wind to keep on dreaming into futures. I battered the cordons around me and cradled my wings on the breeze, then soared to the uttermost reaches with rapturous power, with ease. Just like Sankofa, Johnson's lyrical eye ultimately demonstrates a firm belief in new beginnings and ruptures, which eventually have the power to offer rapture, power, and ease. After all, your world is as big as you make it. That's what is suggested in the opening line. This mood is also featured in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. It contrasts protagonist Jamie, who against all odds dreams herself into distant horizons of new futures, and her grandmother Nanny, who remains in the grip of the past trauma that kills her capacity to dream hope, big enough to find rapture, power, and ease. The novel's opening lines speak of ships at a distance that have every man's wish on board, while fulfilling them unevenly in Jim Crow era West Florida. For some, and against the backdrop of the novel, the some reads as being about the white people. For some, they come in with the tide. While for others, and this others is consequentially all about being black, while for others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. This death of dreams and the respective resignation happened to Janie's grandmother Nanny. Being born into slavery, she was raped by a white man. When threatened to be tortured to death for giving birth to the child, she escaped. Yet freedom did not turn out to be a safe space for her either. Her daughter was raped by a white man too. When she consequently drowned herself in alcoholism, Nanny had to raise her daughter's daughter Janie on her own. Yet traumatized by white patriarchal violence, Nanny does something that the lyrical eye of Johnson's My Little Dreams speaks about. She folds up her little dreams in her heart, eager to forget, because seeing them not coming true is a torture that echoes the tortures that have colored her life. Thus tuned, Nanny says to Janie, I was born black during slavery, so it wasn't for me to fulfill my dreams and what a woman ought to be and to do. I've been waiting a long time, Janie, but nothing I have been through ain't too much if you just take a stand on high ground like I dreamed. Restraining oneself from dreaming is of a piece with the abiding in the narrow nest in a corner that constrains Johnson's lyrical eye in Your World. Eventually paralyzed like Benjamin's angel into a bereavement of dreaming and respective agencies, Nanny, unlike the lyrical eye in Your World, cannot dismantle the master's house, to use Lord's phrasing, and hence dream big. As a result, she forces her granddaughter into a marriage with an elderly black man whom Janie loathes, because to Nanny, this would be at least not rape. This, however, does not correspond to freeborn Janie's understanding of dreaming into futures. Citing herself at the distant horizon, she's upset about the fact that Nanny has taken the biggest thing God ever made, the horizon, pinching it into such a little bit of a thing that you couldn't tie it about her granddaughter's neck tight enough to choke her. This equals the folding up of dreams that eventually keeps repeating history. Just like Douglas' lyrical eyes, Janie, however, does not want to fold up her dreams. Her take on dreams is summarized by the lines that complement the novel's very beginning. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. Women, or some of them, since after all, Nanny does not behave like this. So women pick from the past what they wish to carry with them into the future, thus manipulating dreams into some kind of truth. In other words, women have, just like Sankofa, the capacity to reconstruct pasts based on an amalgamation of both forgetting and remembering selectively, thus helping themselves to what is left at their disposal, dreaming into truth and acting according to this dream truth. Dreams are as powerful as they are fragile, we are told, both in Johnson's poems and Hurston's novel. They can be disillusioned and sentenced to death, or breathed into new lives. In much the same way that the lyrical eye in My Little Dreams unfolds a dream tonight only, expecting to awake in the morning, Janie unfolds Nanny's dreams by setting sail in a dream vessel of her own to travel the sea towards the horizon, from despair to hope. When Nanny's promise that the at least not rape marriage will eventually trigger love does not come true because Mr. Killix, and he is known at Omen, because Mr. Killix belongs to those folks who that were never meant to be loved. Janie's first dream was death. Yet neither did she die, nor did her dreaming dry up. Rather, she became a woman Reading Woman in the light of the opening paragraph, we see Janie asserting her agency from leaving the unwanted past behind by translating the disappointment into a dream that can build new truth, things done, and futures. Janie leaves her husband, Mr. Killix, for another dream, as projected in the midst of patriarchal social order onto another husband. Though Joe did not represent sunup and pollen and blooming trees, that is dream love, he spoke for far horizon. He spoke for change and chance. Janie believes that these changes and chances are about pursuing the American dream together. Yet, just like the Harlem Renaissance was first and foremost a patriarchally coded social and cultural movement, Joe's heading towards the horizon is colored by a patriarchal agenda. After founding their own Black village, he becomes a mayor while silencing Janie into the role of the submissive, serving wife and eventually beating her. Disillusioned, she admits Joe never was the flesh and blood figure of her dreams, but just something she had grabbed up to drape her dreams over. But rather than giving up, she once again folds up her dream while awaiting eagerly once again for the morning to set sail in a dream vessel of her own to travel the sea towards the horizon from despair to hope. Eventually freed by Joe's death, she returns to dreaming again and using its agency for effecting another chance and change. She falls in love with yet another man, who, although a gambler and cheater, Janie friends believe him to be, turns out to be her dream love. Nevertheless, this dream too ends in a nightmare. When defending Janie from a rabbit dog, Tea Cake himself is bitten and succumbs to the disease. In the frenzied state, Tea Cake attacks Janie, who fatally shoots him in self-defense. Pondering on this bittersweet ending from the standpoint of the opening lines, I wonder whether this third dream actually unfolded as described. In other words, catching rabies might be a metaphor with which to imply Tea Cake violence and thus Janie's renewed disappointment in Black patriarchy for that matter. If, as the opening line suggests, Janie remembers what she can bear in order to keep on living in the midst of disappointments, since dreams are the very elixir that keep her faith in futures, she might have made up this bittersweet ending to keep on dreaming herself into survival or even better, into enjoying life. After all, if she's able to remember Tea Cake as a fulfillment of her dreams, whether he lived up to it or not, symbolically, this very Tea Cake becomes the very bread she needs to eat and have in her mouth while narrating to keep on dreaming, living, and becoming herself in her very own world. It is not only the recalling of the third marriage that might be unreliable, though, since we are told in the opening lines that Janie chooses to remember what suits her best, and the novel's autodidactic narrator keeps focalizing above all Janie's perspective, we may wonder whether the novel's entire narration may rely on an unreliable narrator after all. And if it is rather than an unreliable narrator who is at work here, why would that be the case? Maybe only an unreliable narrator is capable of dealing with the death of dreams in a way that the dreams will not reflect the death of ours, or will not reflect the death of all dreams, as Audre Lorde's lyrical eye stresses. In other words, to Black women like Janie, Sankofa-like dream-driven memories are seemingly the only reliable option for living one's very own life in the midst of a world order that keeps discriminating against Black women intersectionally. By stressing that a selected memory narration can turn dreams into truth and inform actions that do things, the narrator stresses why dream hopes are desperately needed. They pursue horizons, changes, chances, and thus dreams of choice. Millions of dreamers and dreams might have died alone, yet collectively they have survived the death of their predecessors, thus seeking a now that can breed futures. No rupture has ever been a complete break with its past. To the contrary, new beginnings are about processes of continuation in the midst of discontinuity. In the midst of modernity, racism and sexism continue to exist, not publicly, but actively implemented into modernity and modernism by white heteronormative supremacy, with sexism being also executed by Black patriarchy. Forced into these power structures and the respective futures, Black women shared dreams that traveled into futures yet unseen. This is an ongoing revolution in the midst of counter-modernities, a revolution that keeps informing Black women's writing about dreams that have the power to pave new futures. Ultimately, Audre Lorde is just one of those standing on the shoulders of Black women modernist writers who have become giants themselves. And I thank you very much. And now I pass on to Jane Hiddleston.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Can you see and hear me? Yeah, okay, as long as one person acknowledges. Great, okay. So I'm gonna just try and share my screen. Hopefully that's gonna work. I hope you can see that. And I'm gonna be talking today about, mostly about Frantz Fanon, and about Fanon's readings of Mayotte Capécia, and then I'll talk for the end a little bit about Maryse Condé as a kind of comparison. And I'm aware that the title that I've given this paper is sort of a bit kind of problematic and provocative, but perhaps you can see that I'm referencing there Fanon's Peau noire masque blanc in French, or Black skin, white masks. Okay, so while Fanon is celebrated then as one of the great critics of racist discourse, the treatment of Black women in his work has probably been one of its most controversial aspects. So his chapter on the woman of color and the white man, which is largely devoted then to a reading of the texts by Mayotte Capécia, has in particular been kind of quite troubling in its uncompromising criticism. So Fanon is scathing in his denunciation of Capécia's negrophobia, he calls it, as it's expressed then most fully in her novel Je suis Martiniquaise, which has been translated as I am a Martinican woman. And while he uses the text to diagnose the Black woman's apparent inferiority complex, manifested by her desire to become white through her relationship with a white man, he also scorns the text then with this particular vehemence. He insists, sorry, how do I make it? There we go. He insists that Je suis Martiniquaise then is cut-rate merchandise, a sermon in praise of corruption. So Fanon's disdain for the value of Capécia's work is clear, even if it displays also behavior that he conceives as indicative of a broader neurosis that he's at pains to analyze. And it's perhaps then for this reason that this chapter, The Woman of Color and the White Man, is the chapter in Fanon's work that I think has provoked probably the most controversy among critics. So the rather sweeping brushstrokes of Fanon's reading of Capécia reveal certainly a certain unease in his thinking towards the figure of the woman of color. But rather than simply adding my voice to Fanon's feminist accusers, I'm going to reflect in this paper on the assumptions that Fanon makes in his reading concerning the Black woman's putative authenticity, and on the contradictions then underlying his reading of Capécia. So on the one hand, throughout Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon denounces the Black man's profound internalization of racist discourse, to the point that he even suggests that even the Black man's unconscious is white. On the other hand, he vilifies Capécia for her falsity in longing for whiteness, while mistakenly reading Je suis Martiniquaise then as an authentic testimony to a Black woman's desire. The complexities of Fanon's reading demonstrate his ambivalence towards modernist conceptions of authenticity, and reveal then the perplexed status of the authentic in critical discourses in Black women's subjectivity. Fanon was highly influenced by thinkers like Sartre and Camus and Césaire, who can perhaps be associated with a form of modernism in France that denounced alienation under capitalism and colonialism and promoted then instead the recapturing of authenticity. Nevertheless, Fanon also repeatedly suggests in Black Skin, White Masks that authenticity is actually itself merely a myth. It's a fantasy promising a more integrated notion of being that then would kind of lie behind this mask that's imposed by white discourse. But actually then he also suggests that in reality, Black subjectivity is mostly figured in the work as just this kind of void, that there's nothing behind the mask, he suggests. Before finishing my talk, I'm also going to briefly analyse Marius Condé's En attendant notre bonheur, which is also known as Ere Machononon, which is what the English translation is also known as. And I'm going to read this one as a further ironic investigation of these questions then in relation to women's subjectivity. And Condé basically kind of reverses Fanon's model by depicting a Black Martinican woman living in Africa and seeking to embrace Black authenticity through her affair with a Black man then instead of a white man, only then to discover that in fact her search too is based on an illusion. Condé's work on one level suggests that the Black woman's self-construction is a sort of ludic postmodern process of self-questioning. But on another level too, it's interesting that she never quite also abandons this kind of more modernist aesthetic of the quest for authenticity that persisted then in fraught ways in Fanon's The Woman of Colour and The White Man. So basically I want to kind of show that both thinkers kind of at once debunk and cling to a notion of Black women's authenticity. So Fanon's reading of Capécia has generated, as I suggested, a good deal of criticism. One of the most systematic and thorough critical of readings of Fanon's chapter is that offered by Gwen Bergner, published in PMLA in 1995, where she argues that Fanon's masculinist perspective is deeply structural. And I'll just put up the reference on the slide. Bergner argues that if Freud shows how psychical processes construct gender and sexuality according to the binary schema of masculine versus feminine, Fanon adopts a similar model in his analysis of the relationship between the white man and the Black man. And the upshot then is that, like the objectified woman, the Black man signals difference, orchestration, and threatens lack. So the upshot, according to Bergner, is that the Black man is placed then in this kind of feminine position, but the Black woman is excluded from the analysis. And this structure then informs Bergner's commentary on Fanon's reading of Capécia, in which she finds that Fanon basically pays no attention at all to Capécia's point of view and overlooks the ways in which colonial society constructs not only racial, but also sexual difference in hierarchical and inegalitarian ways. Bergner is just one of many feminist accusers, and in a much longer version of this paper, I kind of go through these in a lot more detail, but I'm just going to quickly kind of reference one or two more. But what the vocabulary in most of them, nevertheless, I think often comes up across as quite sort of judgmental rather than analytical. So, for example, I've put up on the slide Clarice Zimmer's objection to what she calls his just kind of straightforward contempt for women. And she makes a kind of personal and emotional stance out of his critical commentary. Lola Young then also goes even further and she identifies what she calls in Fanon a deep seam of fear and rage regarding Black women, a judgment that for her then clearly suggests a kind of broader pathology rather than an isolated misreading. In response to these sorts of objections, another critic, Tracy Deneen Sharpley Whiting, is one of the few to have written in Fanon's defense. So Sharpley Whiting notes that such critics at the same time kind of set up a binary opposition between the philosophy of Black revolution and women's liberation. So they kind of separate these things out too starkly, as if one necessarily sort of works to the detriment of the other. And she argues in response then that Fanon's racist critique was always necessarily in fact inclusive of Black men and Black women. But one of the issues raised by Fanon's reading, about which these critics disagree, is precisely his treatment of Capécia's work as a piece of literature. And this is kind of a very quick extract I'm talking about today from a broader project that I think Pelagia mentioned at the beginning on Fanon and literature, and on the ways in which he reads literary texts, or the kind of assumptions he makes, and what he kind of conceives literature to be and to be able to do across his work. So that's kind of one of my underlying concerns, but I'm just kind of focusing quickly here on the Capétia. But if here Fanon takes text by Capétia then as the basis for his discussion of Black women's inferiority complex, then on some level, one of the problems is that he's treating literature as a form of kind of clinical evidence. So there's quite a lot of confusion, I think, surrounding the status of Capétia's work, and often the critics that read Fanon on Capétia also, I think, make some of those same kind of assumptions, that basically you can read this literary work as if it's some kind of evidence for clinical experience. But the critics that I've been mentioning, and Fanon himself, obviously all predate then the groundbreaking work of another critic, Christiane Macwood, whose Mayotte Capétia, ou l'aliénation selon Fanon, that I've put up on the slide as well. She demands a much more thoroughgoing reassessment of Capétia after she herself explored all the circumstances around the production of Je suis Martiniquaise more rigorously than had been done before. So what she did, she went and interviewed various family members and sifted through the archive of letters and drafts, and reveals that in fact, there was no such person as Mayotte Capétia. Actually, that name is an invented pseudonym, and that the work is in fact based on the experiences of a woman called Lucette Serranus Combet. In 1941 then, Lucette met a French naval officer in a bar in Fort-de-France, run by her sister, and embarked on an affair with him. Most importantly, it turns out then that the text of Je suis Martiniquaise was not, in fact, only the work of Lucette under the pseudonym then of Mayotte, but also the history of its publication, in fact, as a novel, was very complex. Lucette's affair with the naval officer lasted for 2 years, but after the officer's departure, he proceeded to send her some letters as well as his own manuscript, which detailed their affair. And this was a memoir called Dieu et amour.
Many apologies. We are experiencing problems with Jane Hiddleston presentation. While Jane is sorting out her problems, Could we please turn to Saul Nelson for his own presentation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Pelagia. Let me add my voice to all the chorus of thank yous for this wonderful series of workshops. And yeah, I hope Jane's internet gets sorted out so we can finish hearing such a fascinating talk. Right, I'm going to share my screen, which will hopefully work. Cool, and I'll just get going. Okay. Rose Piper remains an unknown figure in the history of modernist art because her work falls, I think, on the wrong side of a basic conceptual divide, that between artwork and commodity. The mediated nature of this distinction, the fact that any modernism worth the name exists somewhere within the gap between artistic and mass production, is hardly justification for a life's work passed deep in the latter's embrace. Piper spent 3 decades designing polyester knits for New York's exploitative garment industry. These years were bookended by 2 solo exhibitions of painting, the first in 1947 and the second in 1989. Moving between the stages of her career generates a series of shocks. We pass from the sleek brilliance of her early oils, as you see here. Here we go. To the industrial functionality of her fabric designs, to the garishness of her late acrylic paintings. It is difficult to know what to do with such shocks. They seem irreconcilable, enough to burst the facade of any linear progressive history of objects. What does Piper, the fabric designer, one-time vice president of knits for Jarmel Knitting Mills, have to say to the painter of blues music and social protest? Can her long-life polyesters be understood in the same terms as her paintings, or do they demand some more fundamental reshaping of our categories? And what would a hermeneutic capable of holding both oil paint and polyester in view simultaneously even look like? And I would only attempt to sketch the first half of that equation, or the first third of that equation today, by focusing on the earlier paintings, and yeah, the future work will flesh out the rest. Anyway, so on the few occasions that art historians have paused to consider Piper, they have preferred to avoid such questions. Traditionally committed to the elevation and contemplation of a few extraordinary objects, modernist art history has found itself poorly placed to consider the challenges posed to its methods by the industrial production of anything at all, let alone imperishable plastic clothing. This situation is changing to reflect the enthusiastic embrace of commodification staged in so much contemporary art, alongside the general reorientation of the discipline towards material and visual culture studies. But this shift has often left the history of modernism behind. In Piper's case, art history has remained with the early paintings, consigning both her fabrics and the late work in which she reflected upon them to oblivion. Everything she produced after 1947 has been written off as a waste of talent, an unfortunate 30-year hiatus, as Graham Locke puts it in one of the few essays to take her art seriously, and she emerges into visibility only in her first guise, as a brilliant young painter, bending modernism towards the articulation of Black women's experience. Scholars such as Locke and Anne Gibson have investigated Piper's early paintings in such terms, probing them for signs of Black feminist consciousness and women's self-affirmation. For Gibson, they broach both a, quote, veiled resistance to white economic domination and the taboo subject of female eroticism, which was made explicit in the tradition of women blues singers like Bessie Smith, close quote. For Locke, they articulate a, quote, female gaze inspired by the spirit of assertiveness Piper had in the blues women. Piper's paintings, he goes on, resist the kind of gender stereotyping that characterized women as emotionally dependent upon men. The drawbacks to this kind of affirmative criticism, which identifies a clear set of political motives by abstracting out historical detail, are in its blind spots. It is not just that, by severing Piper's early paintings from the mutilating circumstances of economic necessity against which she staked out the rest of her life, her later work becomes invisible. More seriously, and what will preoccupy me today, the early paintings are themselves mutilated. Stripped of their critical negativity, they are indexed to the old bourgeois myth, familiar since Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, of art as self-realization. This is to say that Locke and Gibson are both correct to surmise that something new was going on in such paintings as St. Louis Cyclone Blues, which you see on your screen, but wrong to read this force as all positivity. Gibson argues that this kind of painting by, quote, depicting sexualized women in specific situations, close quote, refused bourgeois notions of pliant feminine domesticity. She would presumably see in the woman's upturned face, bathed blue in the light of the window, that same Black female, quote, independence and assertiveness, indeed defiance, bordering on and sometimes erupting into violence, close quote, that Angela Davis has described as the particular essence of women's blues music. But neither Gibson nor Locke is open to the woman's other face, black rather than blue, which emerges where the flick of her hair stands out against the wall behind her to form an exaggerated mouth. This second face pulls the first one downwards, away from the window, back into the darkness and poverty of the figure's surroundings. Here, Piper's painting is closer to that other side of blues music to which Davis is so sensitive, the side that calls out for political action, not by embodying an activist consciousness that did not yet exist, but by naming the problems generated in Black life by the oppression that foreclosed resistance. The problem is named, writes Davis, whether it be eviction, prostitution, imprisonment, or homelessness brought on by floods and the resulting failure of the government to furnish emergency assistance to Black people. Such issues were often stated in such a way that the naming of the problem was likely to provoke at least a rudimentary community consciousness of the need for eventual transformation, close quote. Blind to this second face, which turns towards the miserable state of life under conditions of oppression, Locke and Gibson miss the point that is central to Piper's life and work, that moments of creative self-affirmation, artistic or otherwise, are few and fragile, grounded on the same iron laws of economic necessity that deny creative freedom to the majority of people. No emancipation without that of society, as Theodore Adorno wrote in 1947, the year Piper's exhibition, Blues and Negro Folk Songs, opened at the Roco Gallery in Greenwich Village. And although Piper traveled a great distance away from the kinds of European high modernism he advocated and towards the kinds of Black art he despised, Adorno's maxim could stand in for every one of the paintings she exhibited there, each of which reflects on its own entanglement within the apparatuses of economic and political exploitation it sets out to critique. Piper's artworks insist on their own mediated nature. Her statement to the Rosenwald Fund in 1946 that she intended to, quote, do a series of paintings depicting first the folk Negro, urban and rural, as he comments on himself in his blues, this statement was genuine, not just in its anthropological thrust, an impetus that she shared with Zora Neale Hurston and her friend Sterling Brown, but also in its recognition of what blocked that thrust, of the distance between the lives she represented and the objects she produced. A second-generation migrant from the South, her connection to the rural Southern culture towards which her paintings gravitated was arrived at secondhand. My family came out of the South, she recalled in 1989. But what I knew about the South, I learned from stories told by my mother and father and various relatives. I had to research the background for the blues and work songs I used in my paintings. I didn't know where to find authentic recordings. Sterling Brown told me to go to Harlem record stores and ask for race records. It was a new experience. Regardless of subject matter then, each of the 14 paintings displayed at Roco approached Black life indirectly because each, with the significant exception of the death of Bessie Smith, the painting I showed at the start, and will return to, was a visual reproduction of popular music rather than a straightforwardly realist attempt to catch life on the wing. In one sense, the music stood in for life by acting as Piper's model, the ground for each representation. The viewer, who knew Bessie Smith's Empty Bed Blues well enough to recall its cautionary tale of a woman who brags so much about her lover's prowess that another woman seduces him, would have been able to locate the locked fingers and vacant stare at Piper's seated figure within a framework of broken relationships and sexual license. This viewer would have known the central figure in Backwater who stands before the wrack of the Great Mississippi Flood as the same one who sings in Smith's Backwater Blues that, quote, backwater blues done call me to pack my things and go because my house fell down and I can't live there no more. Yet in another sense, the music was itself displaced by being painted. It was altered, objectified, and inevitably misinterpreted with each visual reproduction. Smith's original rendition of Empty Bed Blues is far from tragic. Like so much of her art, it quivers with innuendo. When my bed get empty, make me feel awful, mean and blue. My springs is getting rusty, sleeping single like I do. Piper's painting can muster none of this levity in its portrayal of a single woman abandoned to her tiny room and staring into space. Smith's anthropomorphic bed springs, rusted up for lack of love, have given way to an angular metal footboard whose bars are more like those of a prison. By altering the emotive content of Smith's songs, Piper's work insists on its own status as imperfect reproduction. In a sense, this is inevitable. The history of modernism is littered with missed encounters between painting and music. But in another sense, by this very inaccuracy, her paintings mine the performativity and reproducibility of the blues, those qualities that derived in part from the music's roots in folk custom and in part from its integration with big business following the 1920s. Songs were treated not as autonomous entities possessed of a fixed identity and linked to a particular artist or composer, but as common property. Emphasis fell on the musician's interpretation rather than the song itself. Piper alluded to this separation between individual performance and written reproduction when she called the blues subjective and highly personal. These qualities also aligned with the interest of the publishers, who could make the decision to record one piece of music rather than another according to commercial or political rather than artistic imperatives. And in this regard, Columbia Records' decision in 1939 not to record Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit can stand as perhaps the most famous example. It was for such capitulation to mass production, to what he called the capital power of the publishers, dissemination through radio, and above all, the sound film, that Adorno damned the blues and its progeny jazz. Jazz is not what it is, as he famously wrote, rather it is what it is used for. Defenders of this most controversial corner of Adorno's work have always pointed to his loathing of reproduction in order to defend him against the less palatable and perhaps more accurate charge of racism. In Frederick Jameson's words, the history of musical development which Adorno has given us is none other than the struggle between music and the commodity form. And it is true that even the most repellent passages of On Jazz are directed against the commodification of Blackness that went along with the popularization of Black music, rather than against Black culture itself. Although, as Saidiya Hartman reminds us, the histories of Blackness and commodification are hardly so easily separated. To condemn commodification in the music of those whose ancestors were themselves human commodities is to miss the critical force of this music. Nevertheless, when Adorno returns to Black music in Minima Moralia, it was to attack once more its reproduction within the leveled terrain of mass culture. Criticizing the standardization undergone by even progressive intellectuals, he walks his reader, he walks us, through the homogeneous interiors of their apartments. On the walls, he points out the deceptively faithful color reproductions of famous Van Goghs like the Sunflowers or the Café at Arles. On the bookshelf, the boiled down socialism. Also the gramophone with a few noisy jazz records that make you feel at once collective, audacious, and comfortable. His point, obvious enough, is that regardless of an artwork's putative content, mass production and consumption levels its capacity to generate dissonance. There's a longer quote. Every opinion earns the approbation of friends, every argument is known beforehand, that all cultural products, even nonconformist ones, have been incorporated into the distribution mechanisms of large-scale capital, that in the most developed country, a product that does not bear the imprimatur of mass production can scarcely reach a viewer, reader, listener at all, denies deviationary longings their subject matter in advance. It seems difficult to argue with Adorno when one recalls the millions of identical sunflowers, those inexhaustible paradigms of modern decorative kitsch that still line interiors across the world a half century after his death. And here we have some things I grabbed off the internet. So you've got the Van Gogh bedspread, the Van Gogh napkins, the Van Gogh wallpaper, the bag, the t-shirt, and in a kind of triumph of postmodern assimilation, you have Adorno's own argument sort of incorporated into the Hollywood movie Mona Lisa Smile and ventriloquized by Julia Roberts. Surely such standardization banalizes whatever antisocial force modernism once produced. But Piper's Empty Bed Blues and the musical tradition it mediates pushes back against the brevity of such a judgment. It suggests that difference rather than equivalence might be the fruit of reproduction and commodification. There's nothing necessarily liberatory in this. Race and class are, after all, categorical differences upon which the more homogenizing effects of capitalism continue to thrive. But it at least suggests that there is more to mass-produced art than standardization, that the gramophone record might generate its own forms of cultural dissonance. As Fred Moten puts it, articulating a Black aesthetic that speaks both through and against the commodity, the history of Blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist. And this is James Baldwin's point too in his novel, Another Country. Whenever the reproduced lyrics of Black music begin to punch holes in his writing. I'm thinking in particular of that scene in which Rufus, the Black jazz drummer, homeless and desperate, visits the home of his white best friend Vivaldo. Like Adorno, Baldwin locates his readers inside a progressive American intellectual's apartment. Here, too, the jazz and blues records stacked against the wall are supposed once played to generate a space of commonality, one in which both men can feel at once collective, audacious, and comfortable, to quote Adorno again. Vivaldo loves Rufus, whose anguished sense of racial difference has driven him away from his friends into an abusive relationship with a white woman, Leona. He wants to help his friend, so he puts on a Bessie Smith record and they talk. But what emerges in between the speech and the music is the distance between the two men, a gap whose coordinates are marked but not clarified by race. I'll read this longer quote. Vivaldo said nothing. His face was pale and angry, and he concentrated on looking through his records. Finally, he put one on the machine. It was James Pete Johnson and Bessie Smith batting out Backwater Blues. There's thousands of people, Bessie now sang, ain't got no place to go. And for the first time, Rufus began to hear in the severely understated monotony of this blues, something which spoke to his troubled mind. The piano bore the singer witness, stoic and ironic. Now that Rufus himself had no place to go, because my house fell down and I can't live there no more, sang Bessie. He heard the line and the tone of the singer, and he wondered how others had moved beyond the emptiness and horror which faced him now. I bet you won't believe this, he said, but I loved Leona. Oh, said Vivaldo, I believe you. Of course I believe you. It's what all the bleeding was about. He got up and turned the record over. Then there was silence, except for the voice of Bessie Smith. When my bed get empty, make me feel awful mean and blue. Oh, sing it, Bessie, Vivaldo muttered. My springs is getting rusty, sleeping single like I do. Baldwin's scene unfolds on two levels. Sometimes the men speak, and each effort ends in the silence of incomprehension. Then the music emerges as a kind of second mediation in which Rufus discerns the finality of his situation, its emptiness and horror. But Vivaldo hears neither Rufus nor the music, since to hear the music properly in this context would be to recognize in it the same things that Rufus does. And this, Vivaldo, who still wants to save his friend's life, will not do. He cannot understand why Rufus is destroying himself, and he dooms him by this very incomprehension. At such points, while the character's speech fights against the logic of the narrative, Smith's italicized lyrics are at one with it. Baldwin, like Piper, strips them of their humor. Instead, they give voice to the deathliness that drives his novel's first section, in which the opening refrain, snatched from Billie Holiday's All of Me, you took the best, so why not take the rest, heralds its close with Rufus's suicide. Another Country was published in 1962. Smith and Holiday were both dead, destroyed in different ways by the racist capitalist society within and against which they had launched their music. By having his character recognize himself in the lyrics of dead Black women preserved in the commodified form of the audio recording, rather than in the speech of his living white friend, Baldwin acknowledges the structuring force of racial difference that interrupts comprehension and dooms the relationships in his novel to break up and death. The problem is named, as Davis would have it. Resolution remains out of sight. Although her exhibition took place 15 years before the publication of Baldwin's novel, Piper too was looking back at the music of the dead, preserved in commodity form. Ma Rainey had died in 1939, Trixie Smith in 1943, and Bessie Smith, the one-time Empress of Blues, had seen her extraordinary career wrecked during the Depression before dying in a traffic collision outside Memphis in 1937. Although disproved, the notion that she had bled to death unnecessarily, having been turned away from a white hospital, achieved widespread and enduring popularity because it chimed with the realities of a segregated America. By the late 1940s, Smith's death had come to symbolize both the aggravated character of racial discrimination in the Jim Crow South and the passing of a more optimistic cultural moment, the Harlem Renaissance, which, as Susan Arndt has so brilliantly illustrated, the kind of dreaming aspect of that moment, when the overcoming of such barriers had seemed within the grasp of Black artists and intellectuals. The construction of an affirmative Black aesthetic in Hurston's novels, the paintings of Aaron Douglas, and the poetry of Langston Hughes had each drawn on the dynamism of blues music, to such an extent, indeed, that Davis has argued for Bessie Smith's status as the paradigmatic Harlem Renaissance artist. Hughes had voiced this link himself in 1926 when he called in his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, for a Black art oriented towards popular culture. And again, Smith was the fulcrum. He writes, let the blare of Negro jazz bands and the bellowing voice of Bessie Smith singing the blues penetrate the closed ears of the colored near intellectuals until they listen and perhaps understand. let Paul Robeson singing Waterboy and Rudolph Fischer writing about the streets of Harlem and Gene Toomer holding the heart of Georgia in his hands and Aaron Douglas drawing strange black fantasies cause the smug Negro middle class to turn from their white, respectable, ordinary books and papers to catch a glimmer of their own beauty. This contradictory beauty, at once critical and optimistic, proletarian and high cultural, was what Douglas attempted to capture in his modernism. It is difficult to exaggerate the influence that his images of black people, silhouetted, their faces upturned, wielding pickaxes, saxophones, and scientific instruments, had on artists of Piper's generation. Sharon Patton has suggested that already by 1930, the depiction of black faces, flat and in profile, had become so distinctive a signifier of Douglas's that, when they appeared in the work of other painters, they operated as, quote, a tongue-in-cheek parody of the master of the new Negro artists, close quote. Douglas made book illustrations, posters, record covers, and easel paintings, but he is canonical for his murals. Aspects of Negro life, painted for the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, moved the viewer through a historical arc, beginning in an idealized Africa before traversing slavery, Reconstruction, and modernity. In each scene, upturned faces are silhouetted against the concentric rings of colored light with which Douglas attempted to visualize black music, in his words, to objectify with paint and brush what I thought to be the visual emanations or expressions that came into view with the sounds. Robert O'Mealy has pointed out the technological reproductive aspect of this. It is, he suggests, unlikely that Douglas would have arrived at the notion of visualizing music through circles were it not for, quote, the new technology of the audio recording with its revolving cylinders and then its rotating flat discs of shellac into which narrow, wavy music grooves had been cut, close quote. Douglas's musical emanations thus operate in a double sense, each of which transgresses the specificity of his medium as a painter. On the one hand, they materialize the sound of the musicians and instruments he depicts as the immediate product of a musical performance, the plucking of a banjo string or the blowing of a horn. In another, they produce that emanation out of a second materiality, the inscribed circular grooves of the vinyl record, or what Adorno might have called its thingliness. Douglas's art can be said to anticipate Piper's in its emphasis on the musical commodification brought about by the phonograph record, but whereas music is an often tragic presence in her paintings, in his it always redeems. In An Idyll of the Deep South, his visual emanations pulse over a scene in which the brutality of slavery is deferred, pushed to the edges of the composition where it lingers in the form of the noose and the shovel, in favor of a moment of snatched humanity, a gathering around the banjo. In Song of the Towers, the sound waves spring from the central figure's saxophone as he climbs a great mechanical cogwheel away from the fires of the South and the smog of urban poverty towards a distant Statue of Liberty. Douglas was no naive utopian. He knew that the grasping hands and belching chimneys with which he populated his foreground were the reality of urban life for the black migrants his painting celebrates. The year after he completed aspects of Negro life, he joined the Communist Party. The Negro artist, he wrote in 1936, unlike the white artist, has never known the big house. He's essentially a product of the masses and can never take a position above or beyond their level. This black proletarian viewpoint appears in the paintings as a kind of transformative communist optimism. In Song of the Towers, the cogwheel on which the saxophonist walks forms one circle and the musical emanations another. In the equivalence between the two, in their intersection, Douglas visualizes both the roots of black cultural expression in the system of urban industrial capitalism and the potential for cultural expression to transform and transcend that system. Mechanization and artistic expression harmonize with one another in the march towards freedom. This was the progressive modernist core of Douglas's aesthetic, the notion of art as a participant in social change, what he called the will to self-expression, the spontaneous creativeness of the later 1920s. The paintings of jazz and Negro folk songs make frequent reference to Douglas. Never cited by art historians, he is just as present in these paintings as Pablo Picasso, who always is. His attempt to capture the sonic form of music in paint inheres in the very conception of Piper's series, while the upturned profiles with which he symbolized anxiety and yearning recur in many of her canvases. But she reversed the communist techno-optimism that pulses through his work. It is only through the bars of a cell that we glimpse an upturned silhouette in Long, Long Time to Freedom, and even then it belongs to someone in flight. In Slow Down Freight Train, the return to Douglas's figure of the black migrant via the theme of Trixie Smith's Freight Train Blues is accomplished via a total reorientation of the picture plane, which is now flipped 180 degrees. So we're no longer looking forwards towards the shining cities and statues and sort of future-oriented images that Douglas gives us in his backgrounds, but we're looking backwards as Piper's migrant raises his head in lament for the life that he's leaving behind. And in The Death of Bessie Smith, which culminated Piper's deconstruction of Douglas's progressive message, we're not even looking back, but down into the gutter. It is no coincidence that this, the outstanding work of Piper's jazz and Negro folk song series, the painting in which all the desperate cynicism of her aesthetic was gathered together and spread flat across the canvas, was also the one in which she abandoned the correspondence that links each of the paintings in her series to a particular song. There is no mention of Backwater or Empty Bed Blues. The bright blood that divides Smith's head from her neck and traces a filament down each of her arms makes it clear that, for all that this is a painting drenched in musical imagery, it is death that we are witnessing. Or rather, it is through death that music in Piper's image becomes visible. She stages the reproduction of Smith's music and her death as two sides of the same process. The painting is overtly citational. In Song of the Towers, the wheel on which the saxophonist walks had been a stepping stone en route to a better life. Douglas's cogwheel reappears in The Death of Bessie Smith, as do the rotating abstract geometries with which he had attempted to visualize the sonic material of Black music. Smith is shown with her head thrown back, profiled like one of Douglas's figures, her lips parted in what could almost be a song. At the same time, however, the painting pushes to breaking point the equivalence approached by Douglas between the visualization of music through paint and its mechanical reproduction. The black half disc that spins inside a yellow one just below Smith's chin brings us closer to the look of gramophone record and turntable than Douglas ever dared to go. His cogwheel and sound waves have merged together into a single circular form, which now sprouts metallic teeth. These encircle Smith's head and bisect her body, cutting through her right arm, the same arm that, as the grisly headlines attested, had been severed at the elbow in the collision that killed her. In Piper's image, Smith is singing as she dies. The abstract mechanism that objectifies the sounds of her voice is the same one that grinds through her body and shears off her limbs. It is because she is dying that she raises her head and parts her lips. This imbrication of musical reproduction and death goes beyond the economic realities of exploitation, what Baldwin called the terrifying economics of a singer's life, whereby working class Black artists like Smith and Holiday generated stupendous revenues for publishers like Universal, only to find themselves swindled out of their earnings and left to die in poverty. It also passes judgment on the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance and the place of Smith's music in the post-war, pre-civil rights landscape into which Piper's generation of artists emerged. Piper did not begin to listen to blues recordings until the late 1940s. Her connection to Smith emerged in the wake of the latter's death. By appearing as a culmination of the economic destitution and racial oppression thematized in the music, Smith's death made her art more vital than ever. This returns us to close to Baldwin and the question of art's commodification. In Baldwin's novels, it is the deathliness of the phonograph record, its separation from the human voices it reproduces, that vitalizes the music's presence in the narrative. Because it is a commodity, Rufus has heard the same recording before, and because he has heard it before, he can notice something else in it when he hears it again, something that speaks to his experience of racial isolation and social death. Baldwin aligns commodification with death and shows it opening onto a form of differentiated listening. Piper's early paintings participate in this. They insist on that most modernist of paradoxes, that immediacy might have become so unrealizable that it can only be snatched at through what is already mediated, that it is by internalizing alienation in its very structure, by approaching the condition of the commodity, that an art capable of grasping the conditions of contemporary life might emerge. Thank you. I'll pass back to Jane now. I'm not sure how to do this.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened, but the internet just completely cut out. But shall I keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I'll just share the screen again, get back to where I was. Okay, is that all right? Can you see and hear?
This is perfect.
Okay, I'm really sorry. It just cut out completely for about 5 minutes, but then it came back. So just to quickly try and pick up where I was talking about the kind of tension between authenticity and inauthenticity in Fanon and in his reading of Capécia, and I was explaining about the kind of publication history of Capécia's Je suis Martiniquaise, or I am a Martinican woman. And I think I just got to the point where I was kind of summarizing that the final text of the novel that was published in 1948 then was actually the combined work of this woman, Lucette, the naval officer, and the editors. And this apparent kind of Martinican woman's story then is actually heavily inflected by the white male perspectives of her lover and her publishers, who clearly had an eye also for what would please the kind of French reading public at the time. So Je suis Martiniquaise is evidently not really an autobiography, and the desires and beliefs of its protagonist can't be construed uniformly to be those of a real life character. So Fanon wasn't in a position to know that Mayotte Capécia was nothing but a pseudonym, who then kind of provided this false unity to a composite and collaborative work. But perhaps he should have been more careful when he assumed that the character was simply a mouthpiece for a putative author. Yet his critics too remain unaware of the presence of these masculine perspectives in the text, and they too often base their arguments on the assumption that the character of Mayotte was this sort of unified feminine subject position, whose point of view then that they too wanted to defend. So at the heart of the debate around this novel, in the wake of Mackwood's research, is the problem, as I say, of inauthenticity. The novel can no longer be taken to be what the title seems to promise with such candor, so that is a portrait of a Martinican woman written in her own words. Indeed, another critic, James Arnold, actually goes so far as to call the work a hoax, a supercherie or a hoax, which implies then it's just kind of unequivocally false. And also that texts, he assumes, can be then identified according to what perhaps turns out to be a quite binary schema of truth versus falsity, or authenticity versus inauthenticity. So while Fanon didn't know about the inauthenticity of Je suis Martiniquaise, it happens, as is well known, that authenticity is nevertheless a major continually irresolute preoccupation for him. Indeed, the entire text of Black Skin, White Masks is based on the argument that colonial racist culture imposes a false mask on the Black man. The Black man's bodily schema is skewed by the racial epidermal schema that's grafted onto him by the white man's gaze. And this false image then is figured in L'Expérience vécue du noir, which is the chapter that's translated as the fact of blackness, kind of badly translated, but the lived experience of the Black man. This false image there is described as a wound or a kind of a brutalization that destroys the Black man's sense of self. Whether or not the Black man can recover a fully authentic subjectivity, though, according to Fanon's philosophy, is uncertain. Whilst in the lived experience of the Black man, he insists that the Black subject, precisely unlike Mayotte Capécia, he says, is in fact driven to understand the meaning of Black identity. It's actually unclear at the end of that chapter whether the persona's tears could provide the starting point for this process. Yet liberation for Fanon would necessarily require the invention of a form of expression better integrated with the subject's bodily experience and grounded in the body's material reality. If the mask were to be thrown off, this could only be achieved through the invention, apparently, of a more authentic embodied expression embedded in lived reality, though it's also not clear in the work how far, that this form of expression can actually ever be really sort of created, given the pervasive internalization of the mask. So really, I'm saying that authenticity is kind of already a problem in Fanon. It seems to be a horizon that he's seeking to reach, but a lot of the work talks about the impossibility of kind of reaching that, given, as I say, this pervasiveness of the racist discourse. So Fanon objects to Je suis Martiniquaise then because the character of Mayotte is so desperate to become white and to conform to the profoundly inauthentic self-image that's constructed by the racist imaginary. The first step in the process of becoming white, according to Fanon then, is when she takes the job of blanchisseuse, which she translates as a laundress, but obviously has that word blanc, white in there. It's as if her activity washing clothes is kind of part of this desire for purification, for sort of bleaching. He also cites a scene where she imagines herself as an angel dressed in pink and white. One is white, so he's citing her, kind of saying one is white, as one is rich, as one is beautiful, as one is intelligent. So basically, from this point of view, Mayot Capessia is guilty of this astonishing inauthenticity. She rejects blackness and idolizes white skin and white culture with all their symbolism. So it's quite ironic then that although the text of Je suis Martiniquaise is in fact a kind of composite fabrication, Fanon sort of reads it as an authentic expression of inauthenticity. So he's of course right that the text is inauthentic, but rather than denouncing the work's filtering of Black feminine subjectivity through the voices of white men, he reads it as a true expression of a Black woman's desire for whiteness. So he's horrified by Mayot's betrayal of Black culture, but remains unaware that the text doesn't then just record this authentic authentic voice of a living Black woman, but instead this patchwork dominated by white, French, and masculine perspectives. So instead he sees it then as a testimony to a real woman's process of self-delusion. So you can see there's kind of strange layers going on there with that notion of authenticity. It's nevertheless, I think, revealing that his revulsion for the character's inauthenticity both demonstrates then and fuels a mindset which again is structured around this binary opposition between some aspirational authenticity and inauthenticity. So between a putative truth and a pervasive falsity that contributes then to his oversight regarding inconsistencies and uncertainties in this complex literary artifact, which is Capessia's text. So Je suis Martiniquaise poses problems for Fanon, and indeed, in fact, for many of its critics, precisely because it's not a direct form of self-expression. It doesn't record a single authentic voice. It's also not simply composed of the voices of white men. So we do get fragments of Lucette's own writing, even if they're framed and constructed in dialogue with the editor's input. So while it doesn't offer the authentic viewpoint of a Mayot Capessia, it also doesn't express consistently and straightforwardly a masculinist and exoticist worldview. At the same time, close reading of the text also uncovers further the indeterminacy of the character's perspective, a phenomenon then that's obviously exacerbated by the work's composite origins. Whether or not we even know about these origins, it's also interesting if you read the text closely, which I'm just going to skip that part now. It's actually interesting that it's very difficult to glean coherently what the narrator's motivations are for apparently prizing whiteness and for choosing a white lover. The narrative voice seems to kind of shift around on these sorts of questions. And certainly, as I say, we're never really given access then to Lucette's voice. Instead, the voice that we hear, though, is in fact also very kind of changeable. It's eclectic and it's open to different interpretations. So the work needs to be read as this complex, often indeterminate fabrication, a palimpsest perhaps, that raises questions rather than offering arguments, and not as a testimony that kind of reflects then a single ideological perspective that can be construed simply as either authentic or inauthentic. So I'm going to move on quickly now to talk about Maryse Condé. And I'll just say a few things about her first novel then, En attendant le bonheur, which is also known as Eren Machononon, first published in 1976, though revised in 1988. And I might have, sorry, I skipped a bit of the Fanon there, but I'll just move to the Capessia slide. So here, this pull between authenticity and inauthenticity is explored in more deliberately playful ways. The Condé's text responds to Fanon and Capessia. It too uncovers the ways in which a Black woman struggles to negotiate the competing mythologies surrounding Black African identity, as well as the place of Black women in racial thinking. But again, it leaves that question of the kind of a notion of Black feminine authenticity, it leaves that open-ended. So the narrator, Véronica Mercier, travels to Africa in the hope of discovering her origins and identity, in an obvious refutation then of the Black or mixed race woman's apparently pervasive desire to move to France and be white. So Condé's protagonist clearly directly rejects Capessia. She says, "I'm not Mayot Capessia. Oh no, lightening the race is not my concern." So in a rejection of her family's bourgeois culture, she maintains instead this image of African identity as a locus for a true Black identity. Integrated then also with a relationship with Black history. She says, in going to Africa, I came to look not for a land populated by Negroes, least of all by spiritual Negroes, but by Blacks, this idea of a kind of true Black culture. Condé intimates her own ironic response to the search by voicing Veronica's imagined vision of Africa before arriving as a kind of great black hole. So that alludes to Veronica's lack of knowledge, but it also echoes the end of Césaire's notebook of Return to My Native Land, where he talks about this grand trou noir, the great black hole. And then Fanon quotes that as a as a kind of part of his critique, I guess, of negritude as being a sort of dead end for Black culture. So Veronica carries out this search, above all then through her relationship with her lover, Ibrahima Sori, who's the Minister of Defense and chosen then because of his ancient African ancestry. So as I say, she's the direct opposite of Mayotte, then she privileges not whiteness, but Blackness. But actually, just like Mayotte, her desire is also fueled by a preconceived stereotype of racial identity. She evidently admires Sori for the idea of Africa that he represents, rather than as a result of any kind of putative understanding she would have of his character. So it's a kind of interesting intertext with the Fanon, since whilst Veronica seems to embrace Blackness, not whiteness, her conception of Black authenticity is also another delusion. It's another mask then that prevents her from thinking for herself. I'm aware that we're really kind of short on time. I'm going to try to kind of quickly summarize. I wanted to sort of say a few things about Condé's own kind of work, on her own kind of more autobiographical work. And I guess I'll just kind of flag that here she published a text called La vie sans phare, which means then life kind of with no sort of makeup, you know, it's sort of, it's going to be authentic, you know, it's kind of clearly supposed to be a declaration of kind of, this is a true autobiographical memoir. Interestingly, so she quotes, for example, the idea of an unadorned self in the manner of kind of Rousseau and his Confessions. I think despite these truth claims, she also clearly elsewhere admits that actually she's kind of playing games, that she's always thinking about her role as a writer as being a sort of construction. And she says then in an interview that I've quoted there on the slide, she says, everybody actually plays a bit, because if you're excluded, you take pleasure in exclusion. You play the role of the excluded writer. I think it's inevitable for writers to play roles. So just to conclude then, both Fanon and Capessia denounce then forms of inauthenticity with which the Black women analysed and portrayed in their works struggle. Both expose the female protagonist's overdetermination by the mask produced by racial discourses, be that then of whiteness or that of Blackness conceived and structured by white stereotype. This critique of inauthenticity nevertheless leaves unclear both the desirability and the possibility of capturing in its stead an underlying authenticity, and reveals the vexed place of that concept then in this analysis of Black feminine subjectivity. On one level, Fanon clearly rejects the mask that Mayotte adopts in order to try to access a kind of integrated subjectivity, a full assumption then of Black being. On another level though, he also implies that there's no such thing as Black being. There's no Black authenticity that can be recovered once the mask is removed. Fanon's call for liberation then ultimately takes the form of an affirmation of a deeper, the form of an affirmation of a deeper authentic being, but of a much more kind of uncertain, open-ended embrace of the human, of human dynamism and of continued self-invention. Condé in turn learns from Fanon, both in gaining awareness of the mask that shaped her own understanding of Blackness, filtered then by what she calls the negro bourgeoisie, and in relinquishing negritude and the quest for Black identity in favour of continual self-creation and the embrace of the dynamism of lived experience. But just lastly, I think it's interesting that authenticity remains both seductive and compelling to Fanon and Condé, even as they suggest in their different ways that it doesn't exist. So both writers in this way kind of display the play of fictions that obscures our understanding of Black women's subjectivity, but persist on holding onto a notion of truth, even as they admit that this can't be kind of grasped in any sort of stable or knowable form. So their reflections on Black women's subjectivity hover in this way, I think, between modernism and postmodernism, and testify to the difficulty of negotiating the pervasive discourses that kind of work to then shape and craft her image from the outside. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'm really sorry about the interruption.
That was fascinating. You all captured our attention, and we are deeply indebted to the amazing presentations. Thank you so, so much. It seems we do not have questions, so I'm going to ask the best of us, Tori and Kathleen, the best of MST 2020-2021, to share some thoughts. If you have a question of your own, we don't have much time, so each one of you will have 1 minute. So Tori, go for it, give it a stab.
Thank you, Hawa, and thank you all for speaking. I was actually just wondering for myself, Professor Hiddleston, how much you would see your work and the work that you study as being in dialogue with kind of African American thought on similar issues. I've been reading Bell Hooks, for example, who talks about the necessity of loving Blackness in America as a resistance to kind of commercialization, and how that might sit within your kind of thought.
Yeah, that's kind of a good question. I mean, to be honest, one of the things that I've deliberately tried to do is actually situate Fanon in relation to Francophone literature. So I'm kind of aware that Fanon seems to be a major starting point for American critical race studies, and a lot of people like David Marriott and kind of Fred Moten, I think, somebody quoted maybe Saul quoted Fred Moten a little while ago, start off by referencing Fanon and then kind of move away from that. I suppose I sort of feel that some of those critics, they don't read French, and they don't read French and Francophone literature, and that's kind of what I can do. I can't do some of what they do. So actually it's all about kind of reading the works in French that he read and kind of trying to make sense of what he said about them, because he says these very kind of eclectic things. So while I've read people like Bell Hooks, as you say, but I guess I'm kind of more almost deliberately kind of trying to situate him in relation to sort of Francophone thought. And all the stuff he did with Negritude is just so interesting. People just think he trashed Negritude, but it's just much more complex. I mean, he's steeped in Césaire, for example. So I'm kind of working out the intricacies of that relationship.
Thank you.
Really amazing work, everyone. Thank you so much. Really, really fascinating. I'm struck instantly, by the interconnections in all of these different papers, particularly, in kind of the struggle between authenticity and inauthenticity, and then also between art and commodification. There's just a lot of, webs of thought that can be connected here in terms of reframing modernism. So wonderful work. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kathleen. I was thinking about the place of commonality that Saul was mentioning, the dreams with our eyes watching on God, the narrative of the voices, the KMT, and the power dynamics. You have been amazing. I was just hoping that, Pelagia, if you don't mind, if we can go around to the speakers, just in case 1 minute, if anybody has something else. Susan, would love to hear your voice again. So Jane, so we'll go around 1 minute, and I'm not sure Lilith is still around, but we'll start with Susan, and just the one last minute, and then Pelagia will take it over. Susan, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, in fact, it is very amazing how the different presentations talk to each other, and where we basically meet in many instances is the kind of fragmentation that needs to happen when reading modernism or even after modernism, because also the post in modern is more than just an after. It's an intervention. And as we have seen in the different examples, that kind of rereading modernism as being multiple, as being entangled, and as being like very much interlinked with both racism, sexism, ableism, so that a certain idea of newness was out there that in fact continued a lot of these atrocities that happened in the 20th century, carrying it in, that happened in the 19th century, carrying it into the 20s. And we can see that this needs to happen, and this was actually happen because Pelagia, you were also asking, like, what did Black women contribute? And as we could see, although the structures, the power structures kept silencing them, they were out there, and now we can revisit these shelves. They have never been empty. They have always been filled, and it's so amazing that this is an opportunity for bringing it back into the discussion. And we can also look at how we do talk about it today, particularly also when it comes to language, because if you go to the 1920s, as we have heard also the Negritude in the 1930s, people were still fighting about counter narrations, which also included a kind of terminology, like reproducing the N-word, reproducing a lot of racist terminology. So I think what we also have to do when we revisit the postmodernism, the after modernism from a post-colonial angle, how can we talk about these fights, also as Fanon, right? Without reproducing the racist codes that were still out there in the 1920s. So that is a question also for me as part of our working group.
Excellent. So take it away.
Thanks, Hawa. Yeah, and thank you, Susan. That was very interesting sort of afterthought. I guess as my final thought, which would open on to where I see my research going, but also that I think is the people focusing on literature have brought out much more clearly than I could. The question of an artistic oeuvre and of a kind of unified subject position is one that I find increasingly fraught, and that Jane's talk obviously pulled to pieces in a really generative way. And I wonder, just as much as I suppose the work of a modernist scholar is recuperation and preservation, and as Susan says, sort of recognizing that the shelves are full, how simultaneously one would do justice to the shelves that are not full, and the reasons why they're not, when they're not. And I feel like, yeah, the term, I'm still mulling the times that Jane was kind of generating there, but yeah, I'd like to leave that question open, and to perhaps, yeah, we can return to it when we have time to speak at more length. Thank you.
Dear Jane.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'd just say that modernism for me is a really kind of problematic term. It's such a vast term, and it means different things to different practitioners in different cultural contexts. And I think I probably came to this also through French modernism, being a kind of scholar of French, and that maybe meant something different to people working in English departments. And then with that, I suppose I just was struck by the kind of the tension just in terms of kind of emphasis between modernism as a kind of embrace of sort of fragmentation and kind of alienation, and then that sort of dreams, desires in Susan's paper and in my paper, the kind of the sort of seductive pull of authenticity, despite this kind of new awareness of kind of fragmentation and alienation, that these two things are actually kind of working in tension with one another. And a lot of the modernist writers that I'm familiar with anyway, I don't know how far that reaches out beyond the Francophone context, but yeah, just I guess we could come back to that term as something that's actually itself quite internally conflicted, as well as kind of varied and diverse across different contexts.
Elijah, you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much to the moderators, and thank you very much to the audience. This was really fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.